dural septa are sheets of dura mater that extend into the cranial cavity and form partitions between brain areas that help to support and limit the movement of the brain. There are three major septa. Now, septa is plural for septum. You know what a septum is. It's a divider, right? Like your nasal septum divides your nasal cavity into two areas. A scrotal septum separates the two testes. Now, so a septum is a divider. So the falx cerebri is the largest of the dural septa. It actually projects into the longitudinal fissure between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. So here you can see the falx cerebri. You'd have one half of the brain here, the other half over here, and that depressed area right there is a deep groove called the longitudinal fissure. So the falx cerebri is in that, and it separates the two sides of the cerebrum. The tentorium cerebellum forms a tent over the cerebellum. So it would be sitting, right here would be the cerebellum, right there is your tentorium cerebelli. And then your falx cerebelli is this little divider right here that would be between the two halves of the cerebellum. Now again, these are anchored to the bone and go between brain areas, so it helps to hold the brain in place so it does not move around a lot and get slammed against that hard bony cage of the cranium. Ventricles are fluid-filled spaces within the brain. As you can see in the image here, everything that is blue, that's not a structure. That is a fluid-filled space. Now, these spaces are continuous with each other. So here you've got your lateral ventricles, sometimes referred to as 1 and 2. And then you have your third ventricle, which runs through the diencephalon. And your fourth ventricle runs between the cerebelli and down the two lobes of the cerebellum and down through the brain stem and continues to become the central canal. Continues to become the central canal that runs down the down through the center of the spinal cord. Now, all of these again are continuous with each other, so the cerebrospinal fluid is constantly flowing, very similar to the way that blood is constantly moving. However, there's not a pump, there's nothing to propel this along blood like we do with blood vessels, but the ventricles are lined with ependymal cells, which are ciliated. Now, they help the blood vessels to produce the cerebrospinal fluid, but because they are ciliated and we are a moving creature, that cilia is constantly moving in the liquid, and that helps to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid throughout the brain and the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, colorless liquid that surrounds the central nervous system. Average about 150 milliliters, and we are continuously replacing that by making more and sending it back into the blood. So it's very similar to blood plasma, but no proteins and high in glucose. I bet you know why. If you didn't say ATP for that highly metabolic organ we call the brain, then you and I need to have a talk. Yeah, we know glucose is gold, right? So what's the function of cerebrospinal fluid? Well, it provides buoyancy. So the brain actually just floats in the cerebrospinal fluid, and that helps to reduce its weight, very much like if you were floating in the water. This prevents the brain from being crushed under its own weight, and without the CSF supporting it, part of the brain would just go through the foramen magnum of the skull. Yeah, doesn't sound good, does it? Also, the cerebrospinal fluid provides protection because it's a watery cushion, and environmental stability because it helps to transport nutrients and waste products, and also help to protect against the fluctuation of the fluid itself. This gives us a nice little representation of where that cerebrospinal fluid comes from. So here in the third ventricle, you can see something called the choroid plexus. So that is the ependymal cells as well as the blood vessels. So here's your capillary, here's those little ependymal cells. We're simply looking at a little piece of that choroid plexus. So the fluids and electrolytes leak out of the capillaries of that choroid plexus. Then the ependymal cells with their little cilia help to secrete and move that fluid into the ventricles, and then it is circulated throughout the ventricles and around the brain and down through the central canal of the spinal cord. Now, we mentioned that we are constantly recycling that, so some of the cerebrospinal fluid gets reabsorbed back into the blood from those dural sinuses that we talked about back in the very beginning of this chapter. Hydrocephalus simply breaks down to mean water in the head. So sometimes we refer to this as water on the brain. Now this is when we have excessive cerebrospinal fluid and it does not drain properly, and that's going to lead to brain distortion and neurological damage if it is not dealt with quickly. Most cases result either from an obstruction in the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid or lack of absorption in the arachnoid villi. Now, infants and young children with hydrocephalus usually present with an enlarged head because as the brain and the fluid increases, it pushes against the skull bones. Now, remember, the sutures are still open. They have not ossified, so that allows the head to expand. But if it develops after the cranial sutures have closed, then the skull cannot expand, and it's going to push inwardly and compress the brain because the cranium can't accommodate that. Now, hydrocephalus can be treated surgically by putting a shunt or a tube that drains the cerebrospinal fluid to other areas, such as the peritoneum in the abdominal cavity, and then the fluid, of course, is simply resorbed. So it is much more dangerous once the sutures have ossified because the cranium cannot expand. Therefore, the ventricles increase and put more pressure on the brain itself. And this just gives you an image of exactly what we just talked about, with the shunt being inserted into the ventricles to drain that cerebrospinal fluid into the abdominopelvic cavity or abdominal cavity.